Well, I'm Josh. Yeah, I'm Josh. I'm a head writer for the DisInsider. First of all, I just want to thank you for talking to me about your new memoir and some of your experience at Disney. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Sure.
First of all, how have you been doing over the last chaotic, I guess, year and a half now, I think, isn't it?
Yes, during all the writing part of it and everything, um,
Yes.
that was a whole new experience for me. I'd never done that before. Something I'd always wanted to do, and I'd started again and again and discarded my efforts. Um, but this last year has, yes, been really interesting, and um, uh, I think when it's over, I think I will probably have a better idea about the effect that it's had, because
Hmm.
I think it has actually had an effect upon, you know, and the way I think about my life, and perhaps even myself, having written
Hmm.
a book and spent such a long time trawling through the past.
Sure. Well, that's one of the things that I just finished it. I have a copy of it here. I just finished it a few days ago, and I very much enjoyed it. One of the things I admired about your writing style was it was very effective in bringing me, the reader, back to those experiences that you had, which kind of blew me away a little bit because it was so many years ago. Was it hard to recount these things, or did your diaries fill in some of those gaps where maybe you hadn't remembered some of those specific details?
Well, memory is a fascinating thing, and I did have a journal, but I didn't write it every day, and very often the journals were full of, you know, moaning about boys I was in love with, and
Which does come through in your memoir, and I love it. It's very romantic.
and so there was a lot of moaning about boys, which obviously gets boring for people to read. So, but as soon as you've got that little chink, the door opens a bit, and then you can slip back to the past. And I it was very vivid. It was very vivid for me. Um, and I was also very lucky because I had my parents had both written autobiographies.
Mm.
My mother had written a very good autobiography some years before, called "What Shall We Do Tomorrow," and hers was more, um, you know, an emotion. She was a very emotional writer. I loved the way she wrote, and she was very much an inspiration for me. I always wanted to write like her. And my dad, of course, was tremendously entertaining and amusing and told wonderful stories. So I could cross-check
Hmm.
what what they said and how they put things. Um, and I'm very lucky that I still have a few people in my life that were there and
Hmm.
part of my childhood, so I could talk to them.
That's really important
Yeah.
because you have your siblings too, and you mentioned that in your book how you're very close with your siblings, which
Of
I thought
course.
was lovely.
Yes.
Hmm.
Yes. My sister Juliet, my brother Jonathan.
Hmm.
Um, and it's so interesting, um, what one remembers and what somebody else forgets.
Mm.
And and of course we have different memories of similar events, of the same event and all that
Hmm.
kind of thing. Um, but once you start digging away, things come up to the surface. It's like you're a you're a sort of metal detector, and you beep,
Yeah.
beep, beep, and then you come across something that you you wouldn't have remembered otherwise if you hadn't been digging.
Yeah, I imagine it comes up in bits too. So you maybe a little bit, and then like you're saying with the metal detector, it comes more and more as you think about it deeper.
Yeah.
Um, and that also makes me wonder. I mean, every memory we have is tied with so much emotion, whether good or bad.
Yes.
Was recalling some of these things, did it bring up a lot of emotion in you? Was it difficult at times even?
Um, yes, and of course, uh, you know, as a writer, that so much of writing is choice.
Mm,
What do I say? What am I going to write about? How am I going to write it? How much am I going to say? How much do I have the right to say?
absolutely.
And certainly if my memories involve other people, um, I never, I was very aware of, I, I didn't want to, I didn't want, I didn't want to invade people's privacy.
Yeah,
But I wanted to, you know, tell the truth.
mhm.
So it's a constant,
It's a bit of a
um,
balance, isn't it?
it is, yeah, yeah, picking your way through a bit of a minefield sometimes.
Hmm. Yeah, and that did come through as well in your book. It's very honest and open, but it doesn't ever feel, for lack of a better word, gossipy. It never feels
Right.
that way, which I think is important, at least like you were saying, for the respecting other people and so forth. Um, of course, going back to the time of the 60s when you were working with Walt Disney,
Yeah.
um, it struck me because even in your opening, I guess the not the first chapter, but the forward, I guess, or before the first chapter, where you mention that Walt was somewhat of a surrogate father to you. And that struck me because a lot of times I hear people, of course I wasn't around then, but most people that were talk about him as kind of Uncle Walt, which sounds a bit different than how you remember him. You mentioned him more of as a father. Could you talk about that? Maybe what about him was father-like to you?
Well, that's a very interesting observation. Um, I think the reason I said that was because he was he was a towering figure, and he was my father's generation,
Mm,
and because he was in a position to influence my life as a father, uh, more than an uncle.
mm,
He, decisions he made were directly would directly influence me,
mhm,
and also because I trusted him. I I trusted that he and believed that he had my best interests at heart. And of course, I mean, I wasn't completely um, naive. I understood that he also had the best interests of the film
mhm,
and of his studio
mhm.
and of my image, that it shouldn't in any way clash with
Sure.
those things. So they and of course he had that kind of influence, that kind of control, where he would veto any photographs if I was holding a drink,
Mhm.
or anything that would be a bit questionable with the Disney
Sure.
image, which of course is now terribly old-fashioned. Um,
It
it's a very different world now.
is.
It's like I mentioned in the book about when I was doing the moon spinners, and I was shooting a scene um, in the little restaurant of on the moon spinner in the moon spinner inn, and I'm at the table with Peter McHenry and Joan Greenwood, and leaning forward and talking very urgently to Peter McHenry, and they stopped the filming and dragged me off behind the camera to run wire all around the top of my sundress and clamp my sundress to my chest so there was no
Oh, that's
shadow
right.
show any kind of cleavage.
Hmm.
you know there mustn't be any suggestion of any cleavage, which, you know I mean, it wasn't that long ago, but it probably seems archaic.
Well,
It seems,
well,
yes.
it's I mean, it's just, I think, it was just of its time, wasn't it? I mean, and the idea of trying to keep you, yeah, like as you said, sort of young, innocent, this image, although you were growing up and going through all kinds of changes and seeing the world and perhaps in different light than you were when you started the contract. Uh,
Yeah,
and that must have been very difficult to kind of figure out how to navigate all of those things.
right, right. And I, you know, I loved Walt Disney, and I had great respect for him.
Hmm.
And um, I wanted I wanted to do what was right as far as he was concerned. It was just when I got a little bit older and I wanted to play certain parts
Hmm.
in different kinds of films, because I was starting to feel my chops as an actress, and I wanted
Hmm.
to spread my wings, if you don't pardon mixing all those metaphors.
That's all right.
um, and I wanted to do things, and they were absolutely, it went against the grain. So,
Yeah.
that was a bit frustrating. And I still feel it's frustrating. I still feel a certain sort of frustration about that all these years later, funnily enough.
That is funny. Well, I mean, yeah, as you recall these things, as I was saying earlier, emotions, I'm sure, come up from time to time. And yeah, you do mention in your book that, he was a very kind man, but he was also a businessman. And
Yeah,
two things can be true at once. He's got both different lenses that he's looking through,
yeah.
that of maybe a father, as you said, but also as a businessman. Um, and that got me thinking, The Parent Trap, and I didn't realize this because that was a film I grew up with as a kid, but I didn't realize it was this year was its 60th anniversary until very recently, and that's quite shocking, actually, because my
Yeah.
wife and I actually sat down a couple days ago and watched it for the first time since we had separately as kids, and it holds up. I mean, it holds up beautifully. Um, it's so funny and witty, and um, I absolutely still love it. But um, it also made me think, when you were filming that and other movies for Disney, did you think at all about the future, what they might be looking like in the future, if people would still be watching them 60 years later, or was it just a job at the time?
Well, obviously, I mean, to think that people would still be watching them 60 years later never crossed my mind. And 60 years, my God, I mean, I couldn't imagine that. I thought I'll be so decrepit if I'm still alive. But in actual fact, it doesn't surprise me that The Parent Trap has survived, because it was, as you so rightly say, it was a very, very well written script by David Swift, who also directed it. He'd written the script and directed Pollyanna, and he
Yes.
was I loved working with David. He really understood actors. He knew how to approach you, how to suggest things, how to he never undermined you. He was a collaborative director. He was wonderful. And I think that they were the best films that I made for Disney, those films. But as far as their longevity, obviously Pollyanna was already, a classic story,
Hmm.
and her message is for all times.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, Pollyanna, the name Pollyanna has gone into the dictionary
Yeah.
as a way of being,
Hmm.
and um, the Parent Trap, I did recognize, actually, and I do mean this, that even at the time, that there was something important about that movie, because up until that point, not very many people were getting divorced. Everyday normal people, ordinary people, didn't get divorced, not very easily anyway. And indeed, my boarding school in England, there was one girl that I knew of whose parents were divorced. And she was so ashamed that they were, that she pretended her father was dead rather than admit that they were divorced. And so here is the story about these two girls taking control of their parents, who have really made a complete hash of their lives. They've really messed up, and the girls take control. And I think that is, it's just such a wonderful idea for kids to think that they can, they can make the right choices where their parents didn't. And it was done with great humor and great characters, wonderful, wonderful character actors. Maureen O'Hara, how marvelous to have her in that movie. She was so beautiful and just breathtakingly beautiful. And Brian Keith. So they were such a perfect couple, husband and wife. They worked together so well. And Joanna Barnes, who played the scheming wife to be, she was brilliant, wasn't she? I loved her. And all the actors were Leo Carroll, who played the priest.
What a fun role.
Yes,
you really even though he's not in the movie a ton, he's someone that you remember because he was such a great character actor, wasn't he?
And the fact he sat there while everyone was arguing, he sat there with his whiskey, enjoying it all so much.
He says, "I think I'll just stay and watch."
I'll just stay. Yes, I thought he was, so that's what Walt, that was his great recipe, was to cast the film brilliantly. And as far as I was concerned, I was surrounded by these fabulous actors, and it took a tremendous onus off me. I just had to learn my lines and not bump into the furniture. And, I didn't feel I was carrying the film, because I wasn't, and that's the best feeling. That's the best feeling, when it's a real collaborative unit, and every single element in it is as important as.
It's a real ensemble film, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
Your contract with Disney ended in the 60s, but later on you went back to the studio in the early 80s to film that Disney animation special for television about the making of I think the Black Cauldron. Was that the first time you'd been back to the studio since finishing?
I think it was, and I don't have much of a memory about it, unfortunately.
Well, I found it's online, and it's fun to just see you talking to the process, the animators and the people that are working on the latest Disney movie at the time, and I think you were going to be perhaps a voice in one of those films. Do you remember anything about that process?
A bubble in the cauldron or something.
Yes, the Black Cauldron. Yes.
I don't know. I honestly, I can't really. I vaguely remember going there and talking about the process, but I know I didn't end up doing a voice for the film. No.
Sure. Well, you mentioned in your book that you went back to the studio a few years ago, and it was such a big experience, a big memorable experience for you, especially seeing Walt's office as it was redone. And that's why I was asking, because I thought your first time back, if it had been in the 80s, what that would have felt like after being back for the first time, perhaps since Walt had passed away and since you'd worked there.
Right. And then, of course, later in the 80s, I did 3 sequels to The Parent Trap. And although mostly they were on location, We did do a little bit in the studios.
Oh, did
And
you? I
it
didn't.
did, of course, it did. Sorry?
Oh, I didn't realize you did those in the studios too. At least part of them. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, they were mostly location, Hawaii, uh, and around Carmel, I think. Um, the funny thing is, my memory is great for when I'm 12, but that's just the way it works, isn't it?
I
Unfortunately,
think so.
I'm terrible at remembering dates and years and when I did what. But the studio was very different,
Hmm.
obviously, because Walt wasn't there. You know, it's like a party without the host.
Sure.
It's it's like a family without the patriarch.
Hmm.
Um, and and the people who were running the studio were not integrated into the life of the studio in the way Walt was.
Hmm.
Um, you know, he was wandering around the studio every day.
Sure.
It wasn't like, oh my God, there's Walt Disney. Oh, we're going, you know,
Right.
because he was there.
And he'd pop in. You'd expect him to show
Yeah,
up because
yeah,
he would, right?
that's right. He was, you know, hanging around. Well, not hanging around. That sounds. But he was there, you know, and he was always very well dressed. He was either in a suit or he would be wearing a pair of grey trousers and is it those um cardigans? I think are they called alpaca? Uh
Perhaps you could be right. Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about.
the sort of open weave wool. He used to
Hmm.
like those yellow ones, I remember. And and his wife Lily would turn up and you know it would everybody knew them and they knew everybody and
It was like a family, it sounds like.
yeah, it really was but you know if people did something they didn't like or you know really kind of let the side down they got fired, boom, like that.
Yeah.
So there was great respect and great affection, and this is from my perspective.
Mm.
And and all the people in the studio. And the fact that it was small, you know, it was a small studio and it was small in terms of acreage, but also it wasn't huge. There weren't enormously tall buildings,
Sure.
mostly two-story buildings, except for the animation building.
Mhm.
Well,
Well, trying to look. Oh, I think we're running out of time. Went by so quickly. Now, your memoir sort of ends, like you said, it ends around in the early 70s. Would you ever consider writing one for your second half of your career, uh, in your adult years, and some of the theater work you've done? Because I know you've done quite a bit of theater work in the second half of your career.
yeah, yeah. Um, well, it it would be very different. It would be very different. I mean, at the moment, I'm so relieved to have finished this one. Uh, you know, um, and once it's up and out, um, uh, you know, I, I don't know. I think it would have to be something very different, and I don't quite know what. I discovered I do love writing very much. Um, and of course, I was helped by my son Crispian, who was my guide, you know, and helped me. He helped me with the structure, which is terribly important. Otherwise, you go wandering off, as you
It's
know.
so easy to do as a writer, isn't it?
Yes,
To go off on tangents or,
yes.
yeah.
And then you go there, oh, and then how do I get back? And
Yeah.
oh,
You
and
start with
then
one thing and then you wonder how you ended up someplace completely different.
yes, yes, yeah.
Well, I think that um, fans of your work, particularly of your Disney work, will really find a lot to enjoy in your in this memoir. I know I did. I learned a lot, and I just want to thank you for writing it. And I hope that people check it out. It's available in September, right? Early September.
It comes out in America on the 7th. Yeah.
Yes, that's excellent.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you, Josh. I've really
Thank
liked
you.
talking to you.
I love talking to you too. Thank you so much. I wish you the best. I hope that you can go out and enjoy things as soon as everything sort of settles down, whenever that will be.
Yeah. All right. Lovely. You take care.
You as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.